Coogs House. So, with the latest Big 12 rumors, we have to think about what does that play out like for the Big 12, and how does that play out with Houston joining the Big 12? I got a few, we'll say fictional for now ideas. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, today the podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way you can get the latest on the Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. We appreciate you making Locked On Coogs your first listen of the day. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. It is good to see you again. We're approaching 700 subscribers, which means we're approaching 750 subscribers. We're doing something giving something away, I should say, every 250 subscribers. So at 750, we're going to be giving away a Galen Robinson designed the Letterman jackets that Substantial, his brand, put out earlier this year. We got a size extra large, never been worn before. It fits kind of like a smaller extra large or a large. Anyway, we're going to be giving that away at 750 subscribers. It's a really cool jacket, all kinds of UH for the city and a Cougar and all the kind of stuff on it. So U of H is very well represented on it for sure. Make sure you hit subscribe down below so we get 750, and make sure that you like and comment so that way we know, exactly who we're going to give it to. We're going to give someone that is commenting and liking all of the videos. Now, if after watching this episode entirely about potentially adding a bunch of Pac-12 teams and some, we'll say, fictional for now ideas about how that might go, you don't necessarily want to talk about Houston Cougar football anymore, tell us, I don't know, favorite vacation you've taken. Now, what I will say is that we've got some news on the Pac-12 in the first segment. We're going to talk about how that plays out for the Big 12 and the University of Houston in that. The second and third segments are two different thought experiment ideas I had about what a newer look Big 12 could look like in going coast to coast with it. All right. So first segment, news, Pac-12, how that impacts the Big 12 in Houston. And second segment, third segment, different ideas and concoctions and things like that. Entirely thought experiments. If you have your own thought experiments, please plug them down below. Find me on Twitter at Paintsworth512. I'll be happy to engage. I think this stuff is fun when there's finally time in between basketball games to talk about things that are going right. I think the idea of growing the Big 12 is a lot of fun. We don't get to grow the Big 12 though without adding teams from other conferences. And notably right now, that is the Pac-12. Now, the reason the Pac-12 is getting picked on, I guess we should start with, is that USC and UCLA are leaving the conference for the Big 10. The Big 10 is the second most money-making conference, Big 12 being the third, in the near future with their TV rights deals and things like that. USC and UCLA are jumping ship out of the Pac-12 and going into the Big 10. No, geographically, it does not make sense. The city of Los Angeles is cool and all, but it does not exactly fit in with Detroit, Michigan. But that's where they're going, right? I will say that I guess for the Michigan Midwestern schools, they get to go to LA at least once a year, it sounds like. That could be nice, right? It's nice to go there as opposed to Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Wisconsin's supposed to put on a great football game. I know it's fun, but let's be honest, you'd rather be on the beach too, right? So I get that, but I digress. That means that the two money-making schools, the two highest revenue schools being in Los Angeles, being the major universities in Los Angeles and being very, very large universities in Los Angeles, big-time athletic programs at that, they're leaving the conference. And so suddenly the Pac-12 is down to 10 and is frankly looking like they're going to bleed some of those 10 because their current TV deal, which is set to expire soon, is getting each school about $20.8 million. And that is with all games on TV and ESPN Plus. And that deal includes the networks paying for USC and UCLA. Now, the Big 12 and their short-term near future deal looks to be making well over 25, maybe even closer to $30 million per school, even though schools like Texas and Oklahoma are leaving the conference, right? And so right now, like, I guess you could argue that the Pac-12 should be like asking for more money because like things are different than when they signed the deal they're currently on, however many years ago it's been now. Now the issue there is that no major TV package is going to want all to show all of these games and pay all of that money if they're losing the Los Angeles market. You start to look at like what is the evaluation going to be on the Pac-12 without those two schools. The latest it looks like is that they may get something like just a little bit below $25 million, which would put them $5 to $8 million lower than what they get what a school will get in the Big 12 with the Apple TV Plus company. Now, Apple TV Plus is a low-end streaming company as far as like the big boys go. I think, as I saw, they are the 9th highest revenuing streaming service. They don't really have the live sports option the same way that a lot of others do as well. Like Hulu has live sports. Remember that, right? And so they're frankly like putting a lot of chips in this basket. So I get why, like, oh, okay, that's all that Apple has, like, whatever. But it'll still have them kind of behind the 8 ball compared to other conferences. You have to imagine that it would sign for at least as long a deal as the Big 12 is on, because other conferences are on longer deals, right? Aren't re-signing later. Like the Big 12 in Houston will re-sign a TV deal between now and the next time the SEC re-signs a TV deal, right? The other thing is that the Apple TV Plus deal is rumored to just want the streaming network, I should say, wants just one major marquee game a week. The same way that like NBC will have like an SEC game every week. Like you think about like how often is Alabama playing on Saturday afternoon on the SEC? It's not on the SEC network. It's on ESPN networks. It's on like NBC, right? Those kinds of games, the one-off game where they get to pick like a high revenue game. That's all Apple TV wants. And frankly, without having confirmation on dollar amounts, that's not going to be a lot of money because they're only putting it into one game. And frankly, if you're Oregon or Washington, and that game's going to be you a lot of the time, are you going to put yourself into this deal with the Pac-12 and Apple TV Plus and end up having to, be the only team that actually gets put on TV on it? You're not like boosting you're not raising all the boats with the tide. You're just sitting as the big boat in the middle of the water. How that impacts Texas, Big 12, Houston, Texas Tech, all these schools that like are with us, right, is like the state of Texas is going to have, its own 4 schools in the Big 12 still. We have all those set up. And you no longer have to look in the state of Texas for that other school. You can look outside. You can look to these Big 12 schools. And we know that Brett Yormarker, the Big 12 commissioner, with Texas, Oklahoma leaving, has said he would like to extend the conference from coast to coast. And the thought there being that you can get a big game in every time zone. You can have a big game in Orlando at UCF at noon Eastern. You can work your way east to west, hit some Texas schools, hit BYU and the Utah schools, and then you hopefully can get into the West Coast time zone by adding some of these potential Pac-12 schools. Now, he has not, I guess, mentioned them by name publicly, but that's the understanding, right? The goal there for Houston would be that you'd open up a bunch of recruiting avenues all over the country. Also, in adding big names to the conference, Oregon, Washington, Arizona State, etc., you would theoretically raise the price tag for the conference for that next TV deal in 2031. Because the interesting thing about the Big 12 is that there's this unique spot where they're getting a brand new TV deal in 2023-24, and they're going to be re-signing a brand new TV deal in 2030-31, which is before the Big Ten and SEC ahead of it in the money-making scheme of this are signing theirs. And so suddenly the idea that you could add teams now and boost your price later, that would be an opportunity for the new teams in to boost their own price as well before they would get to do so in the SEC or the Big Ten. So the opportunity lies on them to make more money, but also then ties in and brings Houston potentially more money. Now, speaking of more money, before we go into too far into my thought experiments and getting into where I think this could go for Houston, let's talk about FanDuel. Now, FanDuel is the number one sportsbook in America, and it is the midway point of the NBA season. It's here. It's time to download FanDuel because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. It's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from money line to point scores to threes drained, etc. I'm recommending, now the NBA is coming back, that you look at Friday night's game between the Houston Rockets and the Golden State Warriors. It's happening up in Houston. They only got the Warriors favored by like 10 points, and I'm thinking that game is a blowout. Houston is playing for Victor, and that's going to be wins in the far future. But in the near future, Golden State needs to win some games to kind of climb that playoff seeding ladder. So look for all of that to go dramatically one-sided in that basketball game. That's not going to be a single-digit basketball game. It's definitely going to be like a 17 to 25 point basketball game. So make sure you go check that out at FanDuel. FanDuel also lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with same-game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so I said I had some crazy thought experiments, and so I have a 16-team idea and a 20-team idea, and making the Big 12 no longer 12. So what do you want? 16, let's start with 16. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that in the 2023-24 school year of sports, the Big 12 will have 14 teams, and then Texas and Oklahoma leave, and so we're down to 12 teams, right? So my thought is for the 2024-25 school year, if you added 4 teams, you could then have 4 different 4-team divisions in football, like revenue sports, basketball, etc., right? The schools I'd like to add for this thought experiment would be Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado, right? The 4 corner schools, as they've been commonly called on, your message boards and Twitters and things like that. Then you could have a West, East, North Central, South Central, or just North and South division within the conference. So in the Eastern Division, you'd have Central Florida, West Virginia, Cincinnati, and Iowa State, right? East Division. Iowa State being the furthest east of the old Big 12 schools outside of West Virginia. I don't think West Virginia is an old Big 12 school. They joined the conference in like the 2010s. Anyway, those 4 would make up your East Division, right? Your North Division, Colorado, Kansas State, Kansas, Oklahoma State. You give Coach Prime real estate, no pun intended, although that worked well. You give a lot of open-ended there. Oklahoma State has had a good football program in the past. In basketball terms, men's basketball, obviously, as a revenue sport, like Kansas State can kind of drum up that rivalry a lot. The West Division would be more or less all new ends, right? BYU is the lesser new of the ones, but you have BYU, Utah, Arizona State. They each get to keep their rivalry, right? That's the Western Division in the 16-team model. And then the South Central, or the South Division of this, would be your Texas schools: Tech, TCU, Baylor, Houston. So each of those 4-team divisions would be fairly centrally, with the exception of the Eastern Division's kind of spread out because Iowa State's like kind of east for the conference, right? They're relatively close together, right? Means travel for fans is great, etc. The way your schedule would work out is you get 3 non-cons and your 9 conference game, right? So your 3 non-cons for Houston right now would be like UTSA, Rice, Sam Houston State, right? Cool. We play them. They're nearby, whatever. Then you play your division, right? And alternating home and away every year. So you get 3 of your 9 conference games every year or your division. So you're immediately building rivalries. You're immediately building like recruit bases in like the other parts. So like the Texas schools can maintain that they're, with the Texas schools or whatever. That leaves 6 games, and you could play 2 teams in each division across those 6 games. And so like you play them like 2 this year home, 2 next year away, or vice versa. And then that's 2 years. And then the next 2-year cycle, you'd play the other 2 teams in division, home and away, or whatever, right? So in this first year of this mythical conference, Houston would play Tech, TCU, Baylor in whatever home and away order, because that's their division. They're going to play them every year, right? Rivals. Then you'd play like Arizona and Arizona State, 1 home, 1 away. And then the next year you'd flip it. And then you'd play, in the first year, you'd play Colorado and Kansas State, 1 at home, 1 away. Next year you flip it.
East Division, you play like UCF and West Virginia, one home, one away, and then you flip it, right? And then after that 2-year window, you do the opposite half of the division. So then you'd play BYU, Utah, one home, one away, then flip it. Kansas, Oklahoma State, one home, one away, flip it. Cincinnati, Iowa State, one home, one away, flip it. And that way, when you're recruiting a kid that is maybe not from your division, right, you can guarantee them that in your 4 years at the university, we will play one game at the other location. So if you're Houston recruiting a kid from from like Utah, you're like, okay, we will play BYU and Utah in your 4 years at Houston at least once each place, right? Or if you're recruiting a kid from the Midwest, right? You're like, hey, we will play Cincinnati at least once at their place in your 4 years here. We will play Iowa State at least once in their home and their place in your 4 years here. You can guarantee those kinds of things in this system because you'll play in the course of the kids' 4 years, every team in the division wants at their place and wants at home. It doesn't have to just be your division, in which case you play them every year. You play them 2 at home and 2 away in a 4-year span, right? I think this works in a number of ways. Obviously, I just mentioned the recruiting outlet there. I also think it brings in some natural rivalries across the conference. The one kind of outlier here is, to me, Colorado. Now, I do think that Coach Prime builds that program up, and I think it's kind of nice to, frankly, to help the conference out and giving him what appears to me to be the easiest in terms of prestige football program of the 4 divisions. I also am not like, no secrets here. It looks like Kansas gets the easiest basketball division of the 4 divisions, where like Houston's got to play Baylor, Tech, and TCU, and each of those has kind of turned into a really good program in the last few. I guess Tech is kind of down right like this year, but like each of those is kind of a good basketball program right now. I trust Sampson. I trust the program. I think we're okay. That is all to say that I think you're giving Prime a chance to raise his program status and thus raise the price of the conference's status, because they've got a real chance to win that division. Then, theoretically, once you have these divisions, without knowing exactly what the 12-team playoff would be, you could realistically have a like conference semis and conference finals in football, right? You could have, West play North, South play East, and then the next week the winners play each other as far as like a division winner. That would obviously rely on like, how does the college football playoff play out? How many weeks does that take? Looking up to get to 12 teams, and you're hoping to get a couple of those teams from your conference. You got to have them done playing and right? However, with that said, and obviously logistics being a little bit tricky there because you need 2 weeks for championship week, it'd be awesome to see a true conference championship game play out like that, because most college football conferences don't have that opportunity, right? Most college football conferences just pick 2 teams with great records, and that's how things go. Now, that's a lot of fun and really, really easy with 16 teams. In the third segment, I want to get a little bit to looking at what 20 teams would look like. All right, so in the third segment, I want to talk about what 20 teams will look like, and admittedly, this starts adding a lot. You're going from 12 to 20, right? You're still in 2023-24 at the 14, and then 24-25, you're losing Texas and Oklahoma. And so you're trying to replace those 2 and add 6 more to get up to 20. In a similar thought process, I want to divide the conference up into 4 quadrants or 4 divisions. In the East, I'd have the same 4: West Virginia, Iowa State, Cincinnati, Central Florida, and a 5th team I want to talk about adding in a second. In the South, you'd have TCU, Tech, Baylor, Houston, and a 5th team I want to talk about adding in a second. Okay. In the North, I want to add Utah, Colorado. Have Utah, Colorado, Kansas State, Kansas, and BYU. That all being there. That way you have the rivalries of Utah, Colorado, Kansas, Kansas State, right? BYU, all like Kansas, Kansas State, and then Colorado, BYU, Utah. Those rivalries kind of built in opposite sides of the division, but they're all in the same division that way. Out west, I'd want to add Arizona and Arizona State. Those are both add-ins. Okay. The new add-ins that I think could be more challenging, but high dollar and raise the price of the conference. And frankly, I think both the Big 12 and Big 10 will be seeking would be to add Oregon and Washington, and then potentially one of Nevada or San Diego State. Now, I also thought about Gonzaga here, but that doesn't really help the football division, right? It'd be a 19-team football conference. There are logistical ways to do that, but it's a little bit messier. I'd be open to adding them if we could work that out. But if you added Nevada or San Diego State, you're also adding some team in the general California region, with adding the biggest dollar school you're adding in Oregon and Washington taking over the PNW. Your West Coast division is a true West Coast division suddenly. And very quickly, you're going to have like more nights than not the marquee game on the West Coast as a Big 12 game, or at this point, a Big 20 game. Okay. The other thing about this is that while you're adding all 5 schools that are not currently in the Big 12, you are adding schools that geographically, like your 4 corner schools, Arizona, Arizona State, kind of feel like a natural fit, right? And once you've added them, I've heard rumors about like, will the Pac-12 schools go to the ACC? This division would allow them to play like at least games on their half of the country every year, right? The way the schedule would work, it's still 12 games, still 3 non-cons. So still Rice, UTSA, potentially. Whoever, right? Sam Houston State, whatever. Then you'd play your 4 other divisional games, right? You play your 4 other teams in your division, and then you'd play 3 rotating opponents, right? 1 per each of the other divisions. And then the fun part here would be you hope to build 1 or 2 other division rivals. So like Houston's opposite division rival could be Cincinnati, because there's been bad blood there with the old conference. Or it could be, I don't know, Oregon, because we played them basketball, and that was the team I thought of just now, right? Whatever, or Arizona, right? Whatever. The thought there is that you could build more like cross-state boundary rivalries. And that way you can kind of start to also check off for this recruit in the same way you could talk to the recruit before, like, hey, kid from Los Angeles. Yes, we're recruiting you to play at Houston. I know that seems like a long way away. But with the way this divisional rotation works, if you come to Houston at some point in the 4 years, we will play Nevada. We will play San Diego State. We'll play at drivable distance Arizona, right? That's not far from LA. It's like a 4-hour drive. We will play drivable distances from your hometown, right? Guaranteed. In this instance, it might even be once a year, but at least once or twice in your 4 years at the school, right? That's a big, big bonus for Houston and recruiting kids from all over this wide, coast to coast kind of conference. It's not just about taking the TV dollars at that point, but it is also about taking the TV dollars at that point, because you can tell the kid, hey, if you're from the East Coast, we'll play a couple games on East Coast time zones every single week, or every single year. Sorry. You can tell the kids in the West Coast time zone, hey, we're going to play a couple West Coast time zone games every single year. Trust me, right? Those kinds of things help out a lot. The fun part about this is thought experimenting outside of the 5 teams you add to get to the West Coast division, right? Arizona, Arizona State, Oregon, Washington, one of Nevada or San Diego State, and potentially Gonzaga, one of those teams. Then you look at the East Division. I mentioned that you had West Virginia, Iowa State, Cincinnati, Central Florida, and somebody new. Now, I want Georgia Tech. I think Georgia Tech would, help you bring in Atlanta to the conference. You could bring them in as a recruit tool. You also bring the state of Georgia for TV revenue in a way that, frankly, is kind of an untouched market for the Big 12 and an untouched market for teams like Oregon and Arizona State and things like that, right? The other part of this would be I don't think Georgia Tech will ever go SEC. I don't think we'll ever have to worry about that, because they got next door neighbor UGA, and I don't think they want that smoke, man. I don't think they want to go down that route. Georgia Tech is a much more academically focused school. Frankly, it's a really good school academically. And then I think the thought there would be that we could take advantage, University of Houston, that is, of like recruiting the Atlanta area even more heavily than we have with Doug Belk as like Doug Belk recruits Georgia very well. If you add Georgia Tech,
you only help us out that much more, right? The other school I thought of from a recruiting standpoint would be Temple, kind of the other end of the East Coast. Kind of the same thought process, though. You can get into Pennsylvania. Temple's in Philadelphia. Historic basketball program. You go back to Cheney. But also, like, Pennsylvania is, as a state, has fertile football recruiting ground. You can bring some of those guys in as well, right? That's my thought there. I would add one of those two schools as my first two options in the East Coast division. That means we need to add one more school to the South division. And this is my hot take. The school I'd want to add to the South division at this rate is UTSA. UTSA is rapidly growing the football program. It's exponentially rising and reminds me of TCU in like 2004, right? Obviously, TCU didn't just start a program in 2000. So 2004, in 94, I guess. UTSA just started a program like within the last 15 years, a Division I program, I should say. But they're exponentially rising. The other thing I think about adding UTSA is as a conference, you don't hurt when you lost UT Austin, you lose Central Texas recruiting in some ways, but you also would kind of straddle the city of Austin with Waco and Baylor and San Antonio and UTSA, right? So you could tell any recruit from the area, it's like, okay, you can go to UT Austin, or you can come to the conference and we'll play UTSA and Baylor, and they're an hour either direction, right? Like, it ain't that big a deal. And especially with Austin traffic, like, it might be better to get out of town anyway, right? So that would be my thought process in adding UTSA. The other thing I want to say here in adding a South Division team in this 20-team lineup that people might not want to hear because of some bad blood is the other natural fits are all American Athletic Conference teams. You add a Tulane, you add a Memphis, you add a SMU, some other team that Houston's got the bad blood rivalry with, but bring them into the conference a couple years later. Let us get some of the money first, but bring them into the conference a couple years later, and then you have another rivalry, and you have like Tulane in Louisiana, new state for TV deal, new recruits for new region, right? Memphis, new state for TV deal, new region to recruit in. SMU is not a new state to recruit in or a new place for the TV deal, but I do think that people oversell the similarities between Fort Worth and Dallas. They are, I guess, in the same metroplex area, but those two places are very culturally different. SMU and TCU are very culturally different schools. SMU is like a small private school, crazy expensive, right? So that's my thought there. SMU would be my last pick. I'd love to keep that rivalry going. I do like the I-45 rivalry and the fun trash talking that goes back and forth there, Houston, Dallas, etc. But I like the idea of adding, you're going to stay in state, UTSA. I mentioned the stuff about Austin. Or if you're not going to get UTSA as the growing program, I'd rather add some of these adjoining states to the footprint. Those are my thoughts on a 20-team league. If you've got thoughts on 12, 16, 20, bigger, you think I'm a lunatic that needs to get rid of it all, let me know in the comments down below, and let me know on Twitter at Painsworth512, PAINSWORTH 512 on Twitter, Instagram, and all your social media handles. I'll be happy to talk Cougar football, basketball. I guess baseball is about to start. Baseball did start. It started. Yes, we got ready to talk about that as well. I got a wall of sneakers about to talk about behind me as well. All things Houston sports, Astros, Rockets, etc. Find me at Painsworth 512, PAINSWORTH 512. That's all your social media handles. Thank you so much for making Locked On Coogs your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, I'm going to recommend going over to Locked On Big 12. Josh is covering all of this stuff and more each day at Locked On Big 12. So make sure you check him out there. They're excited about adding Houston. I'm excited about joining up. And frankly, I think some of these teams, I think some of them might make it. So we'll see how it goes. Thank you so much for making Locked On Coogs your first listen today. Locked On Coogs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, or in the case of our basketball team, the number one team in the country. Every day, go Cougs!